our next esteemed panelist, Sachin. And Sachin has over 20 years of experience in diverse domains ranging from consumer electronics, e-commerce, retails, and ITES. He is currently the president of Mumbai Angel, which is a premier platform in India focused on venture investing. And Sachin, it is estimated that the global startup economy has created nearly $3 trillion in economic value between 2016 and 2018. Now, billions of dollars of that economic value may be leaking away, likely by the day. Coronavirus is shaping up to be a perfect storm for the startup ecosystem with simultaneous impact around demand destruction, supply chain distribution, and funding dislocation. So all these three, I think, are being impacted: demand destruction, supply chain disruption, and funding dislocation. What is your assessment of the impact of this pandemic on the Indian startup ecosystem? And what are the attractive opportunities arising out of this chaos? And most importantly, Sachin, if you can also highlight what role Mumbai Angel is playing as a catalyst in this uncertain time to support the startup ecosystem, because we know that Mumbai Angel has a lot of angel investors, and they are have been a big support to the startup ecosystem in India. So this is a critical time when I think all the startups need your valuable support. So if you can highlight those points.
Sure, sure.
Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks, Gaurav. Firstly, thanks for having me around. And yes, this is, like every single panelist has said, these are absolutely, trying times, for all of us. Before I step into the actual, discussion, just a quick context of who or what Mumbai Angels Network is for those who are not familiar. So we came into existence in 2006, 2007. The early success of InMobi Mintra helped us to grow the network to its current size of close to 500 HNI, super HNI folks like you across 9 Indian cities. We have invested in almost 130 startups so far since inception, an amount of almost 150 CR.
Sachin, if I can so if you can put this speaker near to your, yes.
Yeah, is it better now?
Yeah, better, yes.
Thank you so much. And we have invested in around 130 companies, around 150 CR. So as you know, we certainly seem to be, at a vantage point in terms of understanding, the startup ecosystem. And one thing that sort of jumps up, and I'm sure you would agree, that perhaps, as a class of, as an asset class or as a class of people, who represent a certain section of the industry, the startups seem to be the most, how should I put it, ready for, any kind of disaster, because considering the high mortality rate that startup founders are used to, it's almost, okay to believe that they start with the assumption that they are going to, sort of swim with the sharks, or for that matter, they are going to swim with the black swans and the red swans and, swans of any color. So to a certain extent, what we are seeing is a huge resilience, from the startup founders. It was almost as if they were prepared mentally that, hey, you know what, the business that we are in, it's almost like they say in Hindi, like, sar pe kafan band ke khade hue hai. So it doesn't matter what is the nature of the calamity or what is the nature of, the disturbance, but we were sort of used to it. So obviously this is a far bigger, threat than anybody could have ever envisaged. But what we are certainly seeing is that, from so many founders we are speaking to, the sheer resilience, the ability to take that in the stride, and most importantly, to adapt to the circumstances on the fly, is something that's, hugely commendable. As many of you would know, there is a very theoretical exercise that startup founders are expected to do when they start the business, which is a question which they are asked, which is, how many rats have you killed? Where rats are not the real rats that cause plague, but rat is an acronym for the real threat, or the real assumption, or the riskiest assumption that they are supposed to sort of counter. So for example, just to drive home this point, if a startup is in baby care products, the riskiest assumption they have to deal with is what happens if babies stop getting born, right? So that's the riskiest assumption. And each startup has the riskiest assumption which they believe will sort of not come into play during their lifetimes, and they deal with maybe serial number 3, 4, 5. What we have seen now is a scenario where the riskiest assumption that should never happen to a startup, or perhaps something that startups never envisaged, are hitting them. In fact, if I were to do a very, very broad sweep, I know this generalization may not be entirely accurate, but if I had to do a very broad sweep, maybe 15% of the startups have actually realized that they're staring at this rat, so to say, where the product market fit has evaporated, where the business model has evaporated. For example, we invested in an events company which specializes in being the marketplace to have events done at a very cost effective way, marrying all the stakeholders, players. Imagine no events happening, right? There's a company we invested in a year back, which basically makes the luggage movement to international aircrafts and international airports far easier. Imagine there's nothing to transport, there's no passengers flying anywhere. So we see 15% almost of the startups who are really staring at this kind of a rat, speedily adapting to figuring out what they should be doing now. There are maybe at the other end of the spectrum, maybe 10 or 15% of the startups who are substantially insulated, while no one is completely insulated, but substantially insulated. For example, there's a startup we invested in that plans to sort of disrupt the lithium ion battery space using graphene based supercapacitors. They are in a research phase. It's not as if the crisis is going to make them change anything that they're doing right now. But there is a whole 70-80% of startups in between that are seeing anywhere between 10 to 50% compression in revenues, literally like the world has sort of fallen apart. But to my earlier point, again, we see a lot of startups are sort of almost underlining the Darwinian theory, so to say, which is the survival of the fittest, and finally those species survive that are the most sort of amenable to change, that adapt change more easily than others. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say, Gaurav, that that the startup community is perhaps responding the best, I would say, to this crisis, partly because they're mentally conditioned, because they know that they're actually in a war zone ever since they started, being in business, on day one. And perhaps the nature of the beast, perhaps the fact that they're dealing with, crisis day in and day out, with resources far, far limited, than other entities, are making them, much more, stronger. But what we're also seeing, as a trend, is that a lot of helping hands are coming forward. And when we say helping hands, not just lip service, but concrete hands. So, for example, you would recollect, Gaurav, you were on the panel of a virtual life sciences discussion that we did maybe 3 weeks back, maximum 2 or 3 weeks back. And we had showcased a lot of startups there. And you'd be surprised, one of a fairly large pharma company, I can't name that right now because it's confidential, a large pharma company was one of the attendees. They looked at the startup who's planning to do some fairly disruptive work for ostomy patients. They wanted to have a look at the deck. They're MA members, so obviously they had access to all the information we have. And perhaps by next week, we'll be announcing a fairly large infusion that this pharma company is doing, because they realize that in times, even in normal times, these kind of initiatives were required. But if they had to adapt now to the changing circumstances, they're going to need far nimble players, far nimble teams to sort of face the onslaught. And sometimes, as they say, making the elephant dance is always a possibility. But if this elephant has a few ponies around it, for want of a better word, that can run faster, why not? In fact, I was talking to, surprisingly, HR head, of an organization who made that investment in one of the startups, and it was a fairly significant investment, around 2 CR. And I said, look, it's quite strange, that from the HR perspective, you're spearheading this. Usually, we see other functions, R&D, and other functions driving this conversations. And he said, look, these are multiple, ways to look at it. But the way I see it, I'm investing in extremely quality talent that is perhaps going to cost me, I don't know what, 1.5 or 2 CR, as a one-time investment. It's not even an annual CTC. I've invested in that talent. I'm now a shareholder. And these people, as long as I don't smother them with my overheads, as long as I don't smother them with my practices of a larger organization, are actually, perhaps going to deliver far better numbers, whether it's the return on investment, whether it is ROCE. So this is certainly a direction we want to take. And you'd be surprised, Gaurav, this is a trend we are seeing with a lot of startups, who are actually getting, conversations or knocks on their door from corporates across the sector. One of the the easiest to recall is there is a startup that basically does work, in the audio diagnostics. You could cough in a cell phone, and somebody sitting 1,000 kilometers away could figure out whether you have a lung disease. Imagine that's fodder for some of the corporates. But even a corporate that's planning, even a startup that's planning to assess road condition using disruptive technologies is in demand. So I would say, from the context of resilience, the startup founders are absolutely, rising to the occasion. What we have also done to address a part of the question you had asked in terms of what is Mumbai Angels doing. So we are obviously making sure that, we open conversations with as many corporates as possible, including, I would like to make a submission to all the esteemed panelists. Anybody who thinks, that they would like to sort of get closer to what's happening in the startup ecosystem, we would love to welcome them to become, officially, part of the Mumbai Angels fraternity. But we are initiating these conversations a lot because at this stage, what startups need are not just words of encouragement, but just a concrete support. Hey, you know what? My distribution chain is available to you. And obviously, this is not a CSR budget. We will cut out a very strong commercial arrangement, which is win-win for everybody. And startups are absolutely fine with that. But one initiative that's causing a lot of excitement within the startup ecosystem is the Startup Lifeline Infusion Program, where we are putting fairly small sums, anything from as small as 2 or 5 lakhs to maybe 50 lakhs to startups without due diligence, without the detailed investment note, purely on the basis of certain documents that they share. And we would have thought that the hard-nosed investors, would have been a little apprehensive about trying to participate in this program, saying, hey, you know what, I want to visit the facility, I want to do the whole 9 yards. But we are seeing some interesting trends where the investor says, look, and we have, of course, designed the deal in such a way where the investors will have a 40% discount to the next round. But investors are saying, look, I understand, these are difficult times. I don't mind taking a small bet at this stage because it is meant as an infusion. And I mind you, I'm not doing charity. As an investor, I'm not at all doing charity. I'm actually helping the startup in their times of need and making sure that if they can sort of come out of their crisis, smelling of roses, we would be happy to make fairly large sort of infusion. So these are some of the observations we are seeing from our side, Gaurav.
Thanks, Sachin. And I think a very important point that the tenacity that some of the startups are exhibiting in this crisis time, I think we salute their spirit. And I just remember a share on this. वक्त को जरा वक्त दे, ये वक्त भी गुजर जाएगा, कितनी भी काली रात हो, नया सवेरा जरूर आएगा. So
True,
I
very
think
true. Wow.
all these startups deserve a real salute, and I know a lot of startups are also working on innovative range of products for the COVID-19 crisis. So I will now go on to our last